The rain fell in sheets that night, soaking the streets of Oak Ridge, Georgia, and shrouding the small town in a curtain of mist. Officer Derek Whitman sat in his patrol car, the wipers slicing rhythmically across his windshield. The radio crackled, lifeless. The town was quiet, just as he liked it, quiet enough for him to keep things under control, to ensure nothing unfamiliar or off slipped through the cracks. Derek wasn't just a cop, he was a man who believed he knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. Oak Ridge was his town, at least that's how he saw it. So when a black SUV with out-of-state plates cruised down Main Street at just under the speed limit, something in him stirred, something old and bitter and rooted too deep to question. He pulled out behind the vehicle, eyes narrowing. "Let's see what we got here," he muttered, flipping on his lights. The SUV slowed, then came to a smooth stop near the corner of Sycamore and 5th. Derek stepped out, hand resting on his holster. The rain peppered his face as he approached the driver's side. The window was already rolling down when he got there. A black man sat inside. Calm, composed, late 40s, Derek guessed, dressed in a crisp dark suit. No tie, and with the kind of quiet confidence Derek had always found aggravating. There was something about his face, too dignified, too at ease. "Evening, officer," the man said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Derek didn't answer right away. He scanned the inside of the car. Clean, high-tech. The smell of fresh leather and faint cologne lingered in the air. "License and registration," Derek said flatly. The man handed them over without hesitation. "You know why I stopped you?" "No, officer," he said. "I don't believe I was speeding. And my lights are functioning properly." Derek didn't like the way the man spoke, polite, but with a subtle assertion that grated on him. "You've got a cracked rear tail light," Derek replied, though he hadn't checked. "And you were swerving." "I see," the man said, his tone unchanged. "Well, I assure you I haven't consumed any alcohol or drugs. If that's what you're suggesting." Derek's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." The man blinked, then exhaled slowly. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary. I said step out." There was a long silence. The man looked up at Derek, his eyes holding something unreadable. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped into the rain. Rain splashed over the man's polished shoes as he stepped onto the curb. His posture straight, shoulders relaxed. Derek motioned him over to the back of the SUV. "Hands on the car." "Officer," the man said calmly, "I think we're moving beyond a routine stop. If you suspect I'm armed or dangerous, perhaps you should call a supervisor. Don't tell me how to do my job." Derek snapped. "Hands on the car." Reluctantly, the man complied. Derek began a rough pat down, jabbing a little harder than necessary. His fingers searched for weapons, for drugs, for anything to justify his instincts. But there was nothing, just a wallet, a phone, and a set of car keys. "You traveling for business?" Derek asked, his voice almost mocking. "Yes," the man replied. "I'm headed to Atlanta. I had a meeting nearby." "What kind of meeting?" "A security briefing." Derek snorted. "A security briefing? You some kind of private detective?" The man didn't respond. Frustrated, Derek grabbed his arm. "Turn around." That's when the man pulled back slightly, not resisting, but enough to make Derek feel challenged. "You're overstepping, officer." "Wrong move." Derek shoved the man against the SUV, harder than he needed to. The man grunted as his chest hit the metal. Derek's voice rose. "You think you're above the law? Huh?" The man turned his head slowly, rain sliding down his cheek. "I've respected the law more than you ever will." That was it. Derek slammed his arm up behind his back, twisting until the man dropped to one knee. From across the street, someone shouted, "Yo, what the hell are you doing? That's police brutality." Derek barely heard. He was seeing red now. He dragged the man to his feet, cuffed him, and shoved him toward the squad car. "You're under arrest for obstruction," he barked. The man didn't resist, but his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, watched Derek with something colder than anger, something closer to pity. The station house was quiet when Derek dragged the man through the doors. Officer Rena Harper looked up from the front desk, brows furrowed. "Who's this?" she asked. "Obstruction and resisting," Derek said quickly. "Refused to comply during a traffic stop." Rena looked the man over. His shirt was soaked but pressed, his cufflinks still gleaming. "Sir, your name?" she asked. The man remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. Elijah Brooks. Her hand froze mid-air. I'm sorry, what? Elijah Brooks. Raina's eyes widened. Wait a second. Elijah Brooks? As in? Derek rolled his eyes. Don't buy into whatever crap he's selling. Probably gave a fake name. The room fell quiet. A low voice cut in from behind the glass door. Get the chief. Now. A young officer ran toward the back. Seconds later, phones rang. A call came in directly to the station. Another officer answered, and then turned pale. He hung up slowly and looked at Derek like he had seen a ghost. That was the Secret Service. He said, Elijah Brooks is the vice president. Everything went still. Derek stared at the man, still handcuffed. Still silent. The vice president. The second most powerful man in the country. And he had shoved him. Cursed at him. And humiliated him. That's not possible. Derek whispered. But it was. Outside. Black SUVs with government plates were already pulling into the lot. The doors burst open. Men in black suits with earpieces stormed in, fanning out like a SWAT team. One approached Elijah immediately. Sir, are you hurt? Elijah shook his head. I'm fine. Uncuff me, please. Rena rushed forward to do it. Her hands trembled as she removed the metal bindings. Derek stood frozen, sweat pouring down his back despite the cold. Secure the building. One agent barked. No one leaves until we debrief. The chief of police arrived minutes later. Red-faced and wide-eyed. Mr. Vice President, I apologize. We didn't know. Officer Whitman was acting independently. Save it, Elijah said, adjusting his shirt cuffs. This isn't about one officer. It's about the culture you've allowed to grow under your watch. He turned slowly to face Derek. You saw a black man in a nice car and you assumed I was a criminal. You escalated without reason. You humiliated me. And now, because of your prejudice, the whole country will see what's wrong with this system. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Elijah didn't wait. He walked out, surrounded by agents, stepping into the black SUV that had brought him there. The doors slammed shut, and they drove into the rain. Inside the station, silence reigned. Derek felt the weight of what he had done settle on his shoulders like cement. The video, he would learn later, was already online. Millions would watch it. The media would erupt. Investigations would begin. And for the first time in his career, Derek Whitman wasn't in control. By morning, Oak Ridge was no longer a sleepy southern town. It was the epicenter of a nationwide storm. The video had exploded across every major platform overnight. News networks interrupted scheduled programming with breaking reports. On Twitter, #Elijah Brooks, #Oak Ridge, and #Justice for VP were all trending globally. Everyone had an opinion, but the footage spoke for itself. A white police officer pinning a composed black man to the hood of his vehicle, barking at him, forcing him to the ground. The calm voice of the man identifying himself. The rising voice of the officer dismissing it. And finally, the stunned silence when his name was confirmed. It was no longer a traffic stop, it was a national scandal. In Washington, the president called an emergency meeting with senior officials. The press secretary delivered a carefully worded statement. The vice president is safe. We are cooperating fully with the investigation into this deeply troubling event. The vice president himself remained silent for now. But the nation was already reacting. In Oak Ridge, protesters began gathering by midday. Signs reading, "Black Lives Still Matter," and "He could have been killed," flooded the front of the police department. Helicopters hovered overhead. Reporters set up tents on sidewalks. Families that had never seen a news truck on their street now found themselves answering questions from CNN. Inside the police department, the atmosphere had turned cold. Derek sat at his desk, the suspension letter still warm in his hand. His badge and gun were already surrendered. He felt like a man watching his house burn down from the inside. He tried to tell himself it was just a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant to target anyone. But the truth gnawed at him. It had always been easier to spot suspicion in dark skin. Easier to assert power when he felt uncertain. Now, everything was out of his hands. News anchors dissected his face on television, analyzing every twitch of his jaw, every word he'd spoken to Elijah. Former law enforcement experts were invited to offer opinions, some defensive, most condemning. Civil rights leaders held press conferences. comparing the incident to decades of racial profiling embedded in American policing. Outside Derek's home, a line of reporters and cameramen gathered like vultures. He hadn't left the house in 2 days. His wife, Sharon, answered the phone in a constant loop of hang-ups and threats. Their daughter Emily had stopped going to school after students started passing around clips of her racist dad on their phones. When Derek opened the fridge, even the milk seemed to judge him. In desperation, he called his father, retired Officer Mike Whitman, who had patrolled Oak Ridge before him. But even Mike, a man of the old guard, was tense. "You messed up, son," he muttered. "You didn't just stop the wrong man. You stopped the one man you can't afford to." "It wasn't about that," Derek said defensively. "He was acting suspicious. He challenged me." "Of course he did," Mike said, "because he's a black man in America. You just gave the world a front row seat to the kind of policing we've been denying for decades." Derek didn't reply. Back at the police station, Officer Rena Harper tried to keep things afloat, but the calls poured in from every direction: DOJ officials, civil rights attorneys, angry citizens. An internal affairs team from the state capitol was on its way. The town's mayor, a man who once bragged about backing the blue no matter what, now refused to make any public statement. Everyone was scrambling, and somewhere, far from the chaos, Elijah Brooks sat in silence, reviewing the footage again, not for his own sake, but to prepare for what came next. Elijah Brooks had been through worse than Oak Ridge. He'd grown up in a housing project in Detroit, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a textile factory and a grandmother who cleaned government buildings by night. His father had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit when Elijah was 9. The charges were dropped, but the scars weren't. From that moment on, Elijah stopped playing pretend. He stopped dreaming about spaceships or dinosaurs. He only dreamed about justice. He put himself through college on scholarships and grit, graduated top of his class from Howard University, and went on to Harvard Law. By 30, he was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. By 38, he had helped reform policing policies in 4 major cities. By 40, he entered politics. By 48, he was elected Vice President of the United States. But none of that erased what people saw when they looked at him. In every airport lounge, every high-end store, every hotel lobby where you waited too long without being greeted, Elijah felt the gaze, the silent question, "Do you belong here?" He never answered it out loud. He answered with action. The Oak Ridge incident, public, brutal, undeniable, was not just personal. It was historic. For the first time, a sitting vice president had been a victim of the very injustice millions of Americans faced every day. He knew the weight of that. But Elijah wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't want to play the role of the angry black man screaming at the podium. He wanted something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored or swept aside. He wanted change. And to do that, he had to choose his moment carefully. Derek stared at the camera set up in the police station's press room. The department had urged him to make a public statement, something conciliatory. They'd even provided a script. "I sincerely apologize to Vice President Brooks for any discomfort caused during a routine stop. It was never my intention to cause harm." He read it once and tossed it aside. "This is bullshit," he said under his breath. The chief gave him a hard look. "You're not doing this for you, Derek. You're doing this for the department. For the town." "You mean for damage control?" Derek snapped. He paced for a moment, then sat, palms sweaty. The room was silent. The camera blinked red. "I did what I was trained to do," Derek began, his voice tight. "I followed the procedures as I understood them. If I had known who he was." He stopped himself. That was the wrong thing to say. "If I had known," he repeated more quietly, "maybe I would have treated him differently. And that's the problem, isn't it?" A pause. A long one. He looked straight into the lens. "I made assumptions. I reacted with force when none was needed. I saw a black man in a suit, in a nice car, and I thought he didn't belong. And because of that, I disrespected a man who has spent his life serving this country." Another pause. "But more than that, I disrespected myself. Because I thought I was better than that. I thought I was fair. I thought I saw people, not color." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." The room stayed silent after he finished. Later that evening, the footage aired. Some called it too little, too late. Others saw the beginning of something real. But for Elijah Brooks, watching from his home in Washington, there was no satisfaction in the apology. There was only the question, would this be the moment America finally listened? The newsroom of The Atlantic Weekly was buzzing when Maya Lawson slammed her mug on her cluttered desk. A second-year reporter with a sharp mind and even sharper instincts. Maya had covered enough local injustice to know the Oak Ridge incident wasn't just a one-off. Something didn't sit right with her, not just about the footage of Officer Whitman assaulting the vice president, but about how quickly the story was being contained. Too clean, too convenient. While mainstream outlets were dissecting the surface, Maya dug deeper. She started by requesting public records from Oak Ridge PD. It didn't take long to discover Officer Derek Whitman had a history. Over 9 years on the force, he had logged 13 complaints, all from Black or Latino drivers. Excessive force, rude behavior, profiling, every single one had been resolved internally. With no formal reprimand, the pattern was obvious, but more disturbing was how systematically it had been buried. She called former officers. She visited retired police chiefs. She sat in living rooms with mothers whose sons had been bruised and humiliated. One woman, Evelyn Moore, showed her photographs of her son. His face swollen from a beating. He had been pulled over at 16 for matching a description. The charges were dropped, but the trauma lingered. Maya's article, titled, "The Officer Who Stopped the Vice President and the System That Protected Him," broke 3 days later. It wasn't just a profile of Derek Whitman. It was a map of the institutional rot that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. Her exposé wasn't just read, it was felt. It pierced through the noise like a scalpel. Cable news began referencing her work. Politicians called for federal investigations. Even Elijah Brooks, though still silent in public, requested a private copy. The nation was beginning to understand that this wasn't a matter of a single officer. It was about the system that made him possible. The U.S. Senate chamber was filled to capacity, its grand ceilings casting long shadows over the rows of suits and cameras. This wasn't just a committee meeting, it was a national reckoning. C-SPAN carried it live. News banners read, "Senate holds special hearing on Oak Ridge incident and police reform." Senators sat stiffly in a row like judges. Activists, legal scholars, and community leaders filled the audience. The atmosphere was charged, anxious, in-spoken energy humming through every hallway of the Capitol. Elijah Brooks entered without fanfare. He wore a dark gray suit, the American flag pin on his lapel gleaming beneath the lights. He took his seat at the center table, the spotlight falling gently on him, and adjusted the microphone before beginning. "Senators," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "I come before you not as the vice president, but as a citizen, as a black man, as someone who could have been another headline." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "When I was pinned to the hood of my car, cuffed like a criminal, stripped of dignity by someone who didn't know my name or position, it wasn't the first time I felt that fear. But I pray it is the last time this country allows it to happen without change." He leaned forward, locking eyes with the committee. "This is not about Officer Whitman. It is not about Oak Ridge. It is about what we, as a nation, tolerate, what we expect from the men and women behind the badge. Because if I with the title of vice president can be treated like a threat, then what protection is left for those with no title at all?" Gasps rippled softly through the room. "I don't ask for punishment," he said, "I ask for transformation." Over the next 2 hours, Elijah answered every question with clarity and grace. He proposed federal legislation, independent civilian review boards, mandatory de-escalation training, national use of force reporting databases. He demanded transparency. And most of all, he asked for courage. Not the courage to enforce law, but to change it when it became a shield for injustice. By the time he stood and left the chamber, even his political opponents remained seated, speechless. It was no longer a hearing. It was history. While Washington stirred with righteous applause, the country was fracturing. In towns across the South and Midwest, "Back the Blue" rallies grew louder. American flags with blue lines waved above pickup trucks. Derek Whitman's face appeared on posters that read, "He was doing his job." Conservative pundits on television claimed the vice president had set a dangerous precedent by calling out a police officer just for doing his duty. And in Oak Ridge, things turned uglier. Someone spray-painted "Traitor" on Rena Harper's car after she testified to internal investigators about Derek's behavior. Protesters clashed outside the courthouse where a grand jury was convening to decide if Derek would be criminally charged. Church leaders begged for calm, but tensions flared daily. Sharon Whitman tried to hold her family together. Her husband spent most of his days locked in the den, avoiding sunlight. Emily, their teenage daughter, barely spoke anymore. Classmates whispered behind her back. A teacher asked if her father was a bad man during a civics discussion. Derek watched the news, saw his name bouncing across networks, and felt a strange split within himself, one side burning with shame, the other defensive, clawing for some justification. He told himself he wasn't a racist. He had black friends. He never used slurs. He followed protocol. But somewhere inside, the walls were cracking. The uniform he had once worn like armor now felt like chains. And yet, part of him still believed he was the victim. That belief was poison. The Whitman home, once filled with laughter and weekend barbecues, now echoed with silence. Emily locked herself in her room most nights. She wouldn't look her father in the eyes. Sharon, after trying to keep the family afloat for weeks, finally snapped. "You don't see it, do you?" she said one night, her voice trembling as she stood in the doorway of Derek's den. "You still think this is happening to you?" Derek looked up from the TV, startled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're not the one with bruises on his back. You're not the one who gets followed around stores. You're not the one who's been pulled over 8 times in 2 years just for driving while black. You're the one who did it." "I didn't know who he was," Derek said weakly. "That's not the point. You treated him like that because you thought he couldn't be someone important. Because you couldn't imagine a black man being anything but a suspect." Her words hit like knives. "I married a good man," she said, softer now, tears in her eyes. "At least, I thought I did. But I see now you've been carrying something inside you all these years. And it's rottiness from the inside." He didn't argue. He couldn't. The next day, she took Emily and left. No note, no goodbye, just silence. Derek sat on the edge of the bed that night, staring at the indentation where Sharon used to sleep. The house groaned in the dark, hollow and unfamiliar. He reached for his badge, the one the department hadn't asked him to return yet, and turned it over in his palm. It didn't feel like honor anymore. It felt like weight. The vice president's motorcade entered Oak Ridge under gray skies, escorted by a discreet but impenetrable team of Secret Service vehicles. There was no press, no announcement, no podium waiting at City Hall. Elijah Brooks had not come as a politician this time. He came as a man. Word spread quickly through the town anyway. People whispered his name in diners, watched from windows as his black SUV passed the corner gas station, and gathered in small, uncertain knots on sidewalks. But Elijah didn't stop for photos or attention. His eyes remained focused ahead. His first stop was Oak Ridge High School. He walked the halls with the principal, pausing to greet students. In one classroom, a black teenager stared at him in awe and whispered, "You really came." Elijah smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I came because you deserve to be seen." He spoke to a group of seniors about perseverance and civic responsibility. Not once mentioning Derek Whitman. He talked about dignity and choices, about the power of listening. When asked why he returned to the town where he had been humiliated, he said softly, "Because healing only happens when we go back to the places that hurt us." Later that afternoon, he visited Oak Ridge Community Church. There, he met with Reverend Joseph Palmer, who had marched with King in the 60s and had watched decades of progress teeter on the edge in recent years. "This town needs more than justice," the Reverend said. "It needs confession and grace." That evening, Elijah made one final stop, unexpected, unannounced. He walked into Oak Ridge Regional Hospital and stepped into room 406, where an old woman lay resting with IV lines in her arm and oxygen tubes in her nose. It was Evelyn Whitman, Derek's mother. She looked up, startled to see him. The nurse beside her froze. Elijah raised a hand gently. "May I?" The nurse nodded and slipped out. Elijah pulled a chair closer and sat beside the bed. Mrs. Whitman's voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't think you'd come. You wrote to me," Elijah said. "You asked me to." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry for what he did. He's not a monster. He's lost. He learned the wrong things too early and never questioned them. But I did teach him better. I believe you, Elijah said softly. She reached for his hand, frail fingers trembling. I don't want to leave this world knowing my son became a symbol of everything we should be fighting against. Elijah squeezed her hand gently. It's not too late. They sat in silence, two strangers bound by pain neither of them had asked for. When Elijah left the hospital that night, no cameras followed, no applause echoed, but something had shifted, quietly and irrevocably. Derek Whitman heard the knock on his door just after dusk. He hadn't expected visitors. He hadn't expected anything in days. When he opened the door, he froze. Elijah Brooks stood before him, no entourage, no suit, just a windbreaker, slacks, and the same calm presence that had haunted Derek's every thought since that night on Sycamore and Fifth. Derek didn't speak. He didn't move. I'm not here to punish you, Elijah said quietly. I'm here because we both need to speak. Derek stepped aside, awkwardly, and Elijah entered. The house was dim and unkempt. Pizza boxes on the counter, half-drunk bottles on the table, photos on the walls, all from another lifetime. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them thick and electric. I thought about killing myself, Derek said suddenly. The words fell like bricks. Elijah didn't flinch. Why? Because I saw the truth. And I hated it, not just what I did to you, but what I've done my whole career. I thought I was the good guy. I thought I was helping. But I've been hurting people like you, for years. And I never questioned it. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You were taught to fear me. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes violence. But you can still unlearn it. Derek looked down at his hands. Do you think I deserve to be forgiven? Elijah didn't answer immediately. I think forgiveness is not something you receive. It's something you live into. Derek blinked away tears he hadn't realized were falling. I don't know where to start. Start by listening. Start by showing up. Start by not making it about you anymore. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They spoke not only of that night, but of everything that led to it. Race, power, silence, fear. When Elijah left, he shook Derek's hand, not as an equal, but as a gesture of possibility. As the door closed behind him, Derek stood in the hallway, changed in a way that couldn't be undone. The following week, Derek began writing. It started as journal entries, raw confessions he never intended to show anyone. Pages filled with ugly truths, memories he had buried, biases he had never spoken aloud. He wrote about the way his training had conditioned him to see black skin as danger. About the times he laughed at racist jokes in the locker room. About the protests he had dismissed as noise. But as he wrote, something in him softened. His writing turned from confession to inquiry. Why had he ignored the warnings? Why had he dismissed the complaints? He began watching documentaries, reading books, James Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michelle Alexander. He attended a local town hall, sitting silently in the back as community members discussed criminal justice reform. No one recognized him, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. He didn't speak. He just listened. One night, he visited a small memorial that had sprung up at the site of the traffic stop. Someone had placed candles, posters, and a cardboard sign that read, "Dignity denied here." Derek stood before it for a long time. Then he knelt, not in a gesture of apology, but of responsibility. The next morning, he mailed a letter to his daughter Emily. It was 12 pages long. In it, he told her everything. He told her how he had failed, not just as a police officer, but as a father, a husband, a man. He told her he was trying to become someone she didn't have to be ashamed of. She didn't respond, but she didn't return the letter either. And that was enough to keep him trying. Elijah returned to Washington and wasted no time. He met with the president behind closed doors and proposed a sweeping reform package. The Justice in Policing Act would create a federal registry of police misconduct, ban chokeholds nationwide, mandate body cams, and establish a national civilian oversight board. There were skeptics, even among allies, but the country was watching. The country wanted change. In cities across America, police departments began conducting internal reviews. Activist groups used the Oak Ridge case as fuel for long-fought battles. And in one small Georgia town, a once silent police department invited civilian leaders into its walls for the first time. Derek applied to volunteer with a local restorative justice group. At first, they hesitated, but eventually, they agreed, on one condition: he wouldn't speak. He would listen. He would clean chairs, set up meetings, take notes. He would serve without authority. And he did. One night, after a particularly emotional circle where a mother wept for her son killed in a police encounter, Derek stayed behind to mop the floor. The woman approached him quietly. "You were the officer in the video," she said. He nodded. "I hated you," she continued. "Still might. But I saw how you sat there tonight. And I saw how you didn't run from what you did." "I won't," he said. "Not anymore." She walked away without another word. But something in her eyes had changed. Weeks later, a new headline broke. Former Officer Derek Widman joins statewide reform task force as civilian advisor. There was backlash, of course. There were death threats and political noise. But Elijah Brooks stood before reporters and said, "Redemption is not given. It is built, brick by brick, through accountability. And sometimes, the best way to fix a broken system is to invite its survivors and its offenders to the same table." That table had just gotten a little larger. It wasn't easy. Every day, Derek showed up at the community center where the restorative justice meetings took place. He arrived early, stayed late. He brewed coffee, wiped down tables, unloaded chairs from the back of a rusted van. He still wore the visible shame of a man trying to shed an identity that had once defined him. But something had changed. He no longer needed to speak to be seen. In one session, a teenage boy named Darius shared how his older brother had been paralyzed by a police bullet during a mistaken identity stop. Darius stared straight at Derek when he said, "I grew up thinking all of you were monsters." Derek didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. "I did terrible things," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "I'm trying to become someone worth forgiving. But I know that's not yours to give." Darius blinked, clearly unprepared for the answer. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was transformative. At the urging of Elijah Brooks, Derek was invited to speak at small town halls across Georgia, not as a hero, but as a living cautionary tale. He never led the sessions. He sat at the end of the table, let activists speak first, and shared only when asked. He didn't sugarcoat. He talked about arrogance, about implicit bias, about the violence of assumptions. In Augusta, a pastor thanked him quietly after a session. "You didn't preach," the man said. "You confessed. There's a difference." Derek kept a worn notebook in his back pocket. After each meeting, he jotted down one thing he had learned. Sometimes it was a quote, sometimes just a name, but every line in that notebook marked a brick in the slow, uncertain bridge between the man he had been and the man he hoped to become. And while much of the world still saw him as the cop who assaulted the vice president, in those quiet rooms, among broken families and angry youth, he began to be seen as something else. Not redeemed, not absolved, just human. Months after the Oak Ridge incident, the United States found itself in the midst of a cultural upheaval not seen in decades. What began as a single viral video had become a movement of collective introspection. One that crossed political lines, city borders, and generational divides. In Minneapolis, police departments began voluntarily publishing their disciplinary records online. In Dallas, the mayor established the first statewide center for community-led public safety. In New York, officers underwent immersive anti-bias training programs designed not to shame, but to awaken. Federal reform, once a dream deferred by bureaucracy and partisanship, was suddenly within reach. Elijah Brooks stood before the nation in a historic address carried live on all major networks. "We are not here to destroy law enforcement," he said. "We are here to rebuild it in the image of the justice it claims to protect. We are not enemies. We are partners in accountability. We are citizens, and citizenship demands courage." The Justice in Policing Act passed the House by a sweeping majority. It stalled in the Senate, but public pressure surged. Hundreds of thousands signed petitions, flooded town halls, wrote op-eds, and marched not just in anger but in hope. In schools, children debated justice not as an abstract term, but as a personal right. In churches and mosques, sermons were given on the sin of silence. In households, families had the uncomfortable conversations they had been avoiding for generations. Derek watched all of this from the edges, never claiming credit, never stepping forward, He didn't deserve a spotlight. But every reform passed, every new training implemented, every officer who stopped to ask a question instead of reaching for a weapon, that was fuel. He knew the change wasn't because of him. But it was something he could now be a part of. A year after the incident, Elijah Brooks hosted the first ever National Policing Reform Summit in Washington, D.C. Delegates from every state attended. Mayors, police chiefs, activists, survivors, and even former offenders gathered beneath the domed Capitol to discuss, reflect, and build. The event was televised but intimate. Stories were shared, not statistics. Humanity was the metric of progress. On the final day, Elijah stepped to the podium. "I want to close this summit not with a speech," he said, "but with a story." He recounted the night in Oak Ridge, not as a political figure, but as a man who had felt the cold metal of handcuffs and the sear of humiliation. He spoke not of anger, but of awakening, of a moment that cracked something open in the nation's collective soul. Then he looked out into the crowd. "I would like to invite someone here today to speak. He has never asked for forgiveness, but he has earned the right to be heard." A murmur spread through the hall as Derek Whitman stood. He walked slowly to the stage, every step a weight. When he reached the podium, he took a breath and looked out, not at strangers, but at people who had felt what he had inflicted. "I don't deserve this microphone," he began, "but I stand here because of a man who chose not to return hate with hate. I stand here because I was given a chance to face the truth, and that truth nearly destroyed me." He paused, "and I am grateful for that." He told the story, not of the stop, but of the rot behind it, of the jokes he laughed at, the instincts he trusted, the pain he never saw. He told it all, naked, without defense. When he finished, no one clapped, not out of judgment, but reverence. Elijah stood and walked to him. They shook hands, two men once divided by history now bound by healing. In that moment, the country saw something rare. Not absolution, but reconciliation. It started as a school assignment. Mrs. Thompson, a fifth-grade teacher in Oakland, asked her students to write an essay titled, "What I Want to Be When I Grow Up." Most wrote about astronauts, athletes, doctors, but one essay stood out. It began with a simple sentence: "I want to be a police officer who listens." The boy's name was Malik. He was 10, with bright eyes and a quiet intensity. He had watched the hearings with his mother, had seen Elijah Brooks speak on television. He had cut out the newspaper photo of Elijah shaking hands with Derek and taped it to his bedroom wall. "I want to be like Vice President Brooks," he wrote, "because he forgave the man who hurt him and made the country better. And I want to be like Officer Whitman, too, because he said sorry and change. That takes a lot of courage." Mrs. Thompson wept when she read it. Malik's essay was shared on social media. Elijah Brooks saw it and smiled quietly. Derek Whitman received a copy in the mail and read it 3 times before placing it in the notebook he now carried in his coat. Years later, Malik did become a police officer. He graduated top of his class, joined a progressive department, and carried 2 pictures in his locker, one of his mother, and one of Elijah and Derek at the summit. He never forgot why he joined. He joined to see people, to protect them, to listen. And in a quiet town far from Washington, a now retired Derek Whitman sat on his porch, listening to the wind, reading letters from strangers, and knowing that while he could never erase what he had done, he had helped build something that would outlive him. Hope, not perfect, but real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.